I'm Susan Muller, a proud supporter of both the Free Library and its affiliate, the Rosenbeck. The Free Library is dedicated to advancing literacy, guiding learning, and inspiring curiosity. Tonight's lecture and many other thought-provoking programs that stimulate active civil dialogue are made possible only through generous private support. The library is a free-to-all resource serving the needs of 10 million in-person and online visits annually, providing a variety of educational and cultural opportunities for people of all ages. Thank you for considering supporting the critical work by making a gift. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ben Fountain. Ben is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, a bracing, fearless, and uproarious satire of how contemporary war is waged and sold to the American public. It won the National Book Critics Circle Award, was a finalist for the National Book Award, and was adopted by Ang Lee into a popular film. He's also the author of the Hemingway Award-winning Brief Encounters with Che Guevara, exploring America's current existential crisis through wide-reaching reporting. Fountain's new essay collection, Beautiful Country, Burn Again, narrates the shocking and polarizing events of the 2016 American presidential election. Mr. Fountain will be in conversation with Dick Polman, writer-in-residence at the University of Pennsylvania and national political columnist at WHYY News, as well as contributor to The Atlantic. On a personal note, I was fortunate to spend time with Ben and his wife Sharon on a group trip to Cuba several years ago. And as you'll see, he's as engaging in person as he is on the page. We're so pleased to have them here with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ben Fountain and Dick Polman to the Free Library.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the Free Library for having this event, and thank you all for coming out tonight on a not-so-great night, but it's worth it, I guarantee you, and you'll find out why in just a few minutes. I wanted to just, we'll have some questions later on. We'll have time for questions. I just wanted to sort of get into a bit of a conversation here first with Ben. And very, very briefly, we were just talking backstage. You did not, I want to just talk about how you evolved to write this book, which I'll highly recommend. This is your third book, but you started, this was your second career. You didn't start out as a writer like so many writers are just, you know, they get out of college and they immediately get to it. What were you doing, and why did you make the pivot?
First of all, Susan, thank you for the introduction. I was a lawyer for 5 years, and specifically I was a real estate finance and banking lawyer in Dallas, Texas. And if that sounds like your idea of hell, then you wouldn't be far off. Although I learned a lot. I mean, I learned a lot about how the world works. I learned a lot, I think, about business and commerce and what motivates people and how money moves around. And so I wouldn't take it back, but I'm not sure I would do it over again. Anyway, so I turned 30 and thought, if I'm ever going to write books, I better get to it. And my wife and I had talked about me making this move for a long time, and she was a lawyer, is a lawyer, and so she made partner on a Friday, and I gave my notice on a Monday, and yeah, I couldn't wait to get out of there. So I started writing and failed for many years, and still fail a lot, but every once in a while I get a book out.
And so this is your third. First was a collection of stories. Mm-hmm. Second was a well-received novel, which I read a few weeks ago, called Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, and a novel. And here we have a piece of nonfiction, which clearly to me seems like you decide to sort of travel the country for a year. Is that close to the description? In order to sort of get the cosmic reading of this nation during an election year?
Well, I traveled some. I wasn't a regular election reporter. I was very much a dilettante. The Guardian gave me a gig where they asked for a piece every month on the election, and they did have a travel budget for me, and so I spent time in Iowa. I was at the Republican Convention in Cleveland. I went to the Nra Convention in Louisville, Kentucky. And if that's another idea of hell, it's a very particular and surreal kind of hell, American hell, but really fascinating in its own way. So I traveled some. You know, you go out there and you run the campaign for, say, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, and it's very alluring and exciting, and the people you're with, they're interesting, dynamic people, and they're engaged and thinking about things. And so I would get home, and for 3 or 4 days, I would feel like I've got to get back out there. I've got to get back out there. I'm missing things, and I would feel the compulsion to run to the TV every few minutes and check CNN just to see what was happening. And I realized that if I was going to bring anything in the nature of added value to this project, if I was going to contribute something that no one else was thinking of or just a different angle, I needed to stay home and study. To try to go deeper than the daily reportage, and the daily reportage was very important. But, I'm not a journalist by trade, and so I felt like you got to calm yourself down. Just as important a part of the job is digging in deep, reading and studying, as deeply as my mind is capable of, and trying to figure out why things are happening the way they're happening.
Mm-hmm. I can honestly say, as a veteran of multiple campaign cycles, and I was at the Republican Convention too. Funny, I didn't run into you there. The campaign events and the Republican Convention, they felt like you would nail those, the
Thanks.
texture of what those are like. And I thought, and disagree with me, obviously it's your book, but I felt like as I was reading the book, I was getting like sort of the elements of when Norman Mailer would write about campaigns in the 60s, some Tom Wolfe, some Richard Ben Kramer, some of the really great chroniclers of our time. I could sort of feel them in there, between the lines. But why don't you tell everybody what essentially you believe this book is ultimately about, and what are you trying to ultimately communicate?
Well,
about our wonderful nation right now.
I mean, I'm glad you mentioned those writers, and I would add Joan Didion and Hunter Thompson, as long as he wasn't too strung out. And
right.
And Gary Wills is another one, a very fun writer. And so I had a lot to build on, I felt like. I mean, these are very smart writers and people who, brought clear vision and clear thinking. Well, in the case of Hunter Thompson, that came and went. But, to the problem, to the subject matter. And so I felt like I've got to hold my standard. I'm trying to hold myself to as high a standard as that, understanding that, we'll see what the result is. I mean, the basic project of the book was to try to satisfy myself, to the extent I could, why things are happening the way they are. What brought us to this point? Why is Trump running so strongly when it seems that any application of rational thought, critical analysis would show that he's offering nothing to the working people of this country in terms of things that would actually help them, aside from emotional release. And so I felt like on the one hand, we were entering into uncharted waters with this election. By the time we got into the fall of 2015 and Trump was running, really strong after he had said and done things that would have taken down any conventional candidate. And I felt like, okay, this is different. Something new is afoot. But there was also this instinct I was having that, but he's also the very logical culmination of certain strands of American culture and history and politics. And if you allow those strains to, develop and effloresce, Trump is exactly what you're going to get. And so I felt like, okay, this is something I would really like to engage in a systematic way. And then The Guardian offered, this, one piece a month, write about what you want to, go as deep as you want to. And so I jumped at the chance.
Yeah, to borrow three phrases from your book, and these may be in three different sentences, that your aim was in part to bear witness, to provide context for our quote-unquote developing crisis. And how would you describe that developing crisis? Is it still developing?
Yeah, it's still developing. And in many ways, I feel like Trump is as much or more a symptom as he is a cause. Now he's very much a cause. But in the beginning, I felt like he was a symptom. The developing crisis. Is the United States going to continue as an arguably genuine constitutional democracy or not? And I think the country has faced that question in a profound and existential way twice before in its history. The first was the Civil War, which resulted in emancipation. And it was a profound reordering of American society and what it means to be free and equal. And obviously for people of color, the freedom they did achieve with emancipation was very problematic at best and very tenuous and at times practically non-existent. But we did get the 13th and 14th Amendments. I think the second existential crisis and reinvention was the Great Depression and the New Deal, another profound reordering of the notions of equality and what it means to be free, what it means to be free in a society that's, an industrial capitalistic society, and whether there will be, some level of agency and self-determination for common people. And I think, 70, 80 years later, we're again running up against, whether we're going to have some measure of equality, freedom, and self-determination for working people in this country, or are we going to be flattened by forces and institutions that are more powerful than we are?
Mm-hmm. You mention in the book, there's a phrase that you use several times that you say, I think you call this part of the American anthropology, which is profit proportionate to freedom and plunder correlative to subjugation. Now, explain what you mean by, because I think what you're sort of saying is that we often look at freedom as a zero-sum game. If some have it, i.e. whites, then others do not or should not, and that seems to be part of a thread that runs straight through the book.
Yeah, I was trying to get my head around equality, freedom, economics, and how it has worked in the United States, and before that in the colonies. And so profit proportionate to freedom, plunder correlative to subjugation. I wish I had a whiteboard on here. You take the most extreme example in our history. In terms of profit proportionate to freedom, plunder correlative to subjugation, obviously it was the bondage of men and women of color. And slave owners had practically unlimited freedom when it came to their prerogative over these people they held in bondage. It was a monopoly on freedom. That's one way of looking at it. And when you have a monopoly like that of freedom over other people, it is well within the scope of events for you to profit mightily off of these people. That's exactly what happened. By the time of the Great Depression, 1929, 1930, industrial capitalism had created tremendous wealth in this country tremendous concentrations of wealth and power. And it could be argued, and there was quite a bit of evidence in the street at the time, that those forces of industrial capitalism had, in effect, created a new kind of peonage, a new kind of, virtual slave labor in the United States for the working people of the country. And the evidence was in the bread lines, in the soup kitchens, the hobo squats, the National Mall when the bonus marchers occupied the mall, the mill workers in North Carolina who were working for starvation wages, the miners. The forces of industrial capitalism were flattening the working people of this country, which obviously is not a situation you could call, free and equal citizenship stature. And, oh hell, what was the question? Anyway, so, yeah, okay, profit proportionate to freedom. So again, powerful interests in this country, concentrations of wealth, the people who held that wealth held a near monopoly on freedom. And they could exercise their prerogative, their free will, their license over a critical mass of the American population, allowing them to plunder, this population, the working people of this country. And Franklin Roosevelt's genius, just as Abraham Lincoln's genius, was to reinvent the country. And the result was, it wasn't, just a moral action, although it was very much that in both those instances, but it was very much a political action in the service of, getting closer to the aspiration of equal citizenship stature for everyone.
All right. So there's probably a lot of reasons why we see in retrospect why Trump won. I don't know, economic inequality, wage stagnation, race, much more so than maybe we wanted to think originally. But I want to ask you a pointed question about that in a second, but let me just roll back to the beginning of the Trump candidacy in 2015. There's a point in the book where you compare him to J.R. Ewing, the character in the Dallas soap opera from the late 70s. And I was wondering when, did you think of that just while you were writing the book, or was that something that struck you early on?
Yeah, I'm a desperate writer. I'm always hanging on by my fingertips, never sure whether I'm going to keep it together or lose it from one day to the next. And so I'm always flailing and scrounging about for, the words that will do justice to the reality, that's playing out in front of my face. And I felt, Trump was, what he was doing was more about art than politics. And so I found myself thinking about J.R. Ewing and how he turned the paradigm on its head. The hero of Dallas was supposed to be Bobby, the good brother. And he was like a Boy Scout, circa 1950, like he had been formed by 1950s Boy Scout manual. He was loyal, trustworthy, honest, obedient, blah, 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 blah. And he was supposed to be the hero, and J.R. was supposed to be a secondary character. And J.R. Ewing took over the show. And he was everything a Boy Scout is not. He was a snake and a bastard, and he cheated on his wife, and he only cared about himself. And people loved him. And I think what they loved about him was, there was an authenticity working there that people recognized. And that is, yeah, the system's rigged. Actually, it's those kind of people who seem to get ahead. And all these ideals that we've been fed for so much of our lives, actually, that's not really how things work. And it was a terrible show. But there was something genuine in JR that kept people coming back. And so I just thought, and the show started in the late 70s, right around the time Trump was making his move in New York. He bought the Commodore Hotel, 1978, 79. And I could just see Trump sitting in front of his TV watching JR and thinking, yeah, I can work with this. I mean, and really, all I have to do is be me, just more so. And so it was a form of method acting, I think, in a way, and he was tremendously successful at it. And so in a way, Trump was, well, all politicians are performing. Politics is performance. But Trump was taking the performance one step further. He was being outrageous and profane and totally unconventional. And people took that as a marker of authenticity. I'll stop there.
Well, that's a perfect time for me to quote from your book. This is your description of J.R. Ewing, although we think it's J.R. Ewing. You said that he, quote, validated, perhaps the oldest of the founding American fantasies, the honky version of paradise, when a white man is free to take what he wants. And obviously you were, playing the double edge there. All right, so I mean, going back to those early days when he was first a candidate and you were starting to think about perhaps this kind of book, did you think he could make it?
When we came out of the summer of 2015 and he was running strong, after the profanity of his announcement that he was a candidate, and then, the way he insulted John McCain and a number of other things, and the rank appeals for violence at his rallies. And when we came out of the summer of 2015 and he was leading the Republican field, I felt like he had a real chance. And by the end of 2015, I was thinking 50-50. I felt like we were in the presence of a real phenomenon. And I mean, we were all waiting for him to crash and burn, right? I mean, we were all thinking, okay, one day he's going to go too far. He's going to say or do the one thing that is completely beyond the pale. And it never happened. And it still hasn't happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, all right, so when you look, because when you look at his rallies now, sometimes he goes into these impressions of what he thinks traditional politicians sound like and walk like. And, the audience loves that because he's like, it's like he's breaking the fourth wall or something.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And, the entertainment value of it is as much as important as anything. But going back to, one of the things I think that is so strong in your book is talking about the importance of race as an ongoing strain and stain in our culture. And, I remember in the 2016 primaries, when everybody was saying, oh, it's just people who lost their factory jobs are voting for him. And then these exit polls would come out, and you'd see these upscale Republican suburbs in suburban counties voting for him 60-65%. We're thinking, well, they don't have factory jobs, so what is it? And, I think we underplayed for a long time there how important race is, but perhaps you can calibrate it right for us in accordance with what you wrote here.
Well, I think race lies at the very core of the American experience, and it lies at the very core of our politics and our public life, and in many ways, our interior lives. And Trump was a master at playing that. He did a very powerful thing during his campaign. He kept saying over and over, the system is rigged. And it's true. That was a powerful truth he was telling. And I think a critical mass of the country responded to that, in a very welcoming way. And he coupled that with, the oldest play in American politics, and that's the race card. And he combined economic anxiety with xenophobia and conflated the two. And he was masterful at demonizing immigrants, Muslims, people of color. It was very thinly veiled at best, often overt. And it's, it's the easiest play in American politics because it lies so close to the surface of, who we are. And he was absolutely shameless and profoundly good at doing that.
So we're at a point now where, like I think you said this before, we're still waiting for something that's going to, happen, that's going to send him plunging. And we noticed, many of us noticed because we read newspapers, a few weeks ago, the New York Times did this 18-month investigation, finished this 18-month investigation of his family, the Trump family finances, and used the phrase outright fraud in one of the first or second paragraphs. And I'm thinking, well, in what we used to pass for normal times, you write something like that about a president and his family, that person is sunk. And yet it seemed like within like a few days, much like the climate change report last week, by the way, within a few days, it's like, poof, it's completely out of the news cycle. So I don't know, maybe is that beyond Trump? Is it just part of the velocity of events and we can't keep up so everything gets buried?
It's very weird. It used to be a scandal was a scandal. And the first major instance of a scandal that turns out not to be a scandal that I can think of and that I think back to is Iran-Contra in the 1980s. That was a gross abuse of power by the executive branch, and nobody much cared. I mean, it was business as usual, and Reagan certainly didn't, pay any price, and the few people who were convicted were pardoned, either by Reagan or by George H.W. Bush, who was surely up to his neck in it all. And I think you see that pattern playing out over and over again in American life, and it's gotten worse. And so now we've got, Trump, whose entire past is littered with scandal, questionable deals, questionable morals, and it doesn't seem to matter. And so I read that, marvelous piece of reporting in the New York Times. It took me 2 days to read it. I was on the road, but I just carried that New York Times around with me, and it was a stunning piece of reporting. And the whole time I was reading it, I was thinking, it doesn't matter yet. It doesn't matter yet. I mean...
What's the yet?
He has the country in a kind of trance. I mean, there is a kind of mojo, voodoo magic going on in this country right now, and I think it's in the nature of these things that, just looking at Joe McCarthy or looking at someone like Huey Long, although he was assassinated, or somebody like Pappy O'Daniel in Texas in the 1930s and 40s. These demagogues come along and the magic works for about 5 or 6 years, and then something breaks. And it's either just cumulative or a particular thing. With Joe McCarthy, it was the famous McCarthy Army hearings, where Joseph Welch stood up and said, "Sir, have you no shame?" But you felt like, it was the culmination of a lot of things that were building, and that was the thing that broke him. With Pappy O'Daniel, it was more, people they caught on to the guy over time. And after 10 years in politics, he didn't run for re-election to the U.S. Senate. It was clear that people were fed up with him, and he had run out his string. With Trump, you go high, it bounces right off of him. You go low, it bounces right off of him. You throw facts at him, you throw insults, this guy just keeps on going. And so I'm thinking, maybe it just has to run its course. And the shelf life of a guy like him seems to be about 5 or 6 years, which puts us from 2015 around 2020, 2021. He may go longer. We're in strange times, but I feel like the day will come when the country turns on him, and he will be viewed with revulsion and loathing by, a critical mass of the country, and that revulsion and loathing will be shared by many of his current supporters. That's just my gut. I mean, I can't, I really, that's a thesis, a hypothesis. But, to this point, everything that's been thrown at this guy, nothing stops him. He just keeps rolling.
All right, well, in a second I'll talk about one particular maybe break point. But let me ask you this, whether you feel like he keeps going and going, is he being sustained by, there's a term you invent in the book, which you use frequently, you even give it an acronym. It's called the fantasy industrial complex. And you talk about how he is sustained in part by the fantasy industrial complex, which even has to do with our technology, whatever. And you even call it the FIC on subsequent references. Explain to everybody what the fantasy industrial complex is and how that fits into this mosaic.
Yeah, I have a German friend, and I think she emailed me once and she said, well, thick in German means what you think it might mean. The fantasy industrial complex, I had to come up with a name for it to get my head around it. But I feel like it is so powerful, it's even taken over the military industrial complex. I think it's the most powerful force in America. And the proof was in 9/11. I mean, that was a profound event in American life. And it was a cruel and tragic event. And for a few weeks, it shook us out of our stupor. And I thought I saw a really interesting, piece by a fella, and he noted that in the couple of weeks after 9/11, all the bookstores sold out of books on Islam, and all the books on Islam were checked out of public libraries. In other words, people were really looking for answers. It drove people out of their comfort zones. I mean, it was such a mystifying, traumatizing event. But the power of the fic is such, it's like the Blob. I mean, it eventually absorbed 9/11 and turned it into this fantasy narrative of us versus them, good versus bad, Christian versus Muslim, West versus East. Well, why do they hate us? They hate our freedoms. This easy to digest, really infantile narrative, and which ended up driving the country, the military industrial complex included. Humans have always had a gift for fantasy and escapism and distraction. I mean, that's just part of our nature. But with the delivery systems we have now, with mass media, and, the delivery systems that nobody is ever without these days, and we're always looking, the fantasy industrial complex is always with us, to the point that it takes an act of will to disengage from the fic for an hour or two, and for a week or two, would take superhuman effort, but it's the air we breathe now, and mostly it's someone trying to sell us something, a product or a lifestyle or a political agenda, and I think ultimately it makes us numb and dumb. It numbs us out and dumbs us down, and Americans aren't dumb. We've done an extraordinary number of amazing things in our history, but the fantasy industrial complex is doing a number on our minds. And I think, and Trump, he was made for the fic, and the fic was made for him. He's a master at manipulating the fantasy industrial complex. And he was at the very beginning of his career, and he took it to another level with his TV show, and now he's on the ultimate reality TV show in the universe, the presidency of the United States.
Yeah, I think there was a statistic you had in the book that the show would routinely get more than 20 million viewers a week. And, now in hindsight, it almost seems like it was, in-kind free advertising. and because he always had some political ambitions, it seemed anyway. So the question I wanted to ask in terms of the breakpoint, and then we're going to go to questions from you all, is we have in 3 weeks and 1 day, we have midterm elections. And, by all indications, we heard all indications in 2016 as well, but by all indications, the Democrats could pick up the House. Republicans might well keep the Senate. Democrats pick up a share of power. If that happens, it's going to be because we have an enormous, by all the polls say, an enormously angry backlash against Trump for some of the reasons you were describing. You probably read the same, consume the same news I do anyway. But how optimistic are you that the Democrats are going to at least be able to attain a modicum of accountability again, and that could change the trajectory of the presidency?
Well, Dick, I'm a liberal who lives in Texas. And so I won't call myself a pessimist, but I would just say, hopes have been dashed over and over to the point where it's just a question of you get up every day and you do the work, and without fear or hope. If anybody can snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, it's Democrats, and especially the establishment wing of the Democratic Party, which, is utterly clueless and inept, I feel like. So, my gut tells me no. My gut tells me that Democrats will not take the Senate, and they probably won't take the House. And I think the Kavanaugh fight galvanized Trump supporters and the right wing in this country, and history shows they are the most committed regular voters, and we'll see if things have turned and Democrats come out. Democrats won't win the House unless they bring out substantial numbers of new voters. And I think that's the future of the Democratic Party, if it has a future. The Democratic Party can't keep going after these relatively small tranches of swing voters. The Democratic Party has to bring out lots and lots of new voters into the process, and they're out there. The percentage of people in this country who don't vote, most lean Democratic or identify as Democratic. But the Democratic Party, the establishment, has not given them a compelling enough reason to come out and vote the last 20, 25, 30 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are very few swing voters anymore anyway, because everybody's sort of in their trenches.
I totally agree with what you have to say about the Democrats not voting. We outnumber them, for example, in Delaware County here, yet we lose to Republicans consistently. We've made some inroads. But my question is, what would you say about the ideological roots of the Republican Party and their pro-business, pro-religious stances and social agenda that drives them to stay in power and allow fertile ground for a guy like Trump to take root and grow? I think they appeal to our meanest instincts, yet you didn't touch on the Republican ideological roots in all this. Could you say something about that? I'm not trying to charge you. I haven't read the book yet. Mm-hmm. What about that Republican ideology?
All right, a great uncle of mine who was a Republican in North Carolina, which was a very rare creature back in the 60s, we were talking politics one day, arguing politics. He said, all right, what's the difference between a Democrat and a Republican? I was 10 years old. I didn't know. And he said, all right, he said, basic difference is Republicans feel like the best way for society to progress, to prosper, to advance, is to promote business, help free enterprise, look after business people. Democrats feel like the best way to advance society is to prioritize the common man and woman, the working people of the country, in other words, from the ground up. You know, I think there's a lot of truth in that, or used to be. And I think, you know, certainly the Republican Party has become a cartoon version of that over the years. Aspects of that, you know, advancing business, promoting business have morphed into the pseudo-religion of free markets and free market fundamentalism. I think the use of social issues and cultural issues like abortion and prayer in the schools and flag burning, that's a very dark and cynical tale in a lot of ways. I know that there are many people who, I mean, they have strong convictions about these things. But I believe that there is a powerful wing of the Republican Party that's been quite willing, you know, to use those cultural issues for economic gain and advantage. And I mean, you know, in the 60s and 70s, the Republican Party did not have a strong stance on abortion. It was only in the 80s and 90s that issue came to the fore. And then there's the Southern strategy. I mean, Republican Party was the party of civil rights, racial tolerance, the party of Lincoln, up until 1964 when Goldwater was nominated. And just like that, I mean, the Civil Rights Act was enacted in June or July of 1964. Goldwater was nominated at the Cow Palace in San Francisco a couple of weeks later, and it was like the Dixiecrats had taken over the Republican Party. I mean, the Southern Caucus named their hotel Fort Sumter. I mean, and Jackie Robinson, he did a walk around the floor of the convention, and afterwards he said, "Now I know what it was like to be a Jew in Germany in the late 1930s. He said, "I've never been talked to or treated that way." And, you know, the Southern strategy led, you know, it was an integral part of Nixon's election and re-election and the success of Democratic candidates in presidential politics ever since then. So I started with ideology, you know, promoting business, you know, that's the way we advance society, but I've ended up in a much darker place, haven't I? Yeah, can we even call it ideology at this point?
I was a fan of your novel, Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, and I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that, specifically about the reaction you got, most particularly from military. There really have not been many satires of military life since the draft was eliminated. And I don't know if that was your main target or whether you were going after the Dallas business industrial complex.
Well,
But
Ben, you want to just tell everybody just a little bit about what the novel is about?
Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, or as a friend of mine calls it, Billy Lynn's Long Title. It's about a group of American soldiers who've been in combat. Some news footage of their exploits in combat went viral, and so the Bush administration brings them back for a 2-week, quote, victory tour around the country. And the last day of their victory tour, they are guests of honor at a Dallas Cowboys football game, and they are presented at the halftime show amid all the pageantry that goes on at those halftime shows. So you think it's satire. I was writing straight up realism in there. And, but I can understand why it would be viewed as satire, because, I mean, satire relies on exaggeration and hyperbole for effectiveness. And many of the things that take place in that book do seem cartoonish and hyperbolic. And yet, I felt like everything was true to life. And if it had not happened as of the time I was writing the book, it was going to happen sooner or later. And so the reaction from active duty military personnel and veterans, everyone's been very nice to my face. And that tends to be a self-selecting group, the people who like the book and want to express their admiration for it. They are the ones who will seek you out. And the ones who felt like the book was unsuccessful and false, they will probably not expend the time and energy to seek you out. So, and you can find some pretty severe reviews of it on Amazon, but all the vets and military people who've sought me out have expressed, they say you got it right.
So you mentioned the New York Times reporting of the tax evasion of the Trump family. When actually my husband read it to me, and
He read the whole thing to you?
most of it.
I re-reported it to her.
That's quite a marriage if he read the whole.
Anyway,
I mean that in a good way.
my reaction was, okay, the people who can barely afford to feed their families, those people, some of them may have voted for Trump. How are they going to react to these revelations? And what occurred to me was, they're going to say, he got over on the system. Good for him. What's your reaction to that? Is that an accurate way of seeing this?
People see what they want to see until the point where reality overwhelms everything. But until that point, we see and hear what we want to see, what supports our worldview. It will be regarded as fake news. The failing New York Times is taking it to Trump again unfairly, or it proves he's smart. He got over on the system, and I see what a smart guy he is. And by the way, the system is rigged. He was right about that too, and he's so smart, he knows how to work the system. So, it's an interesting psychology, and it's very human.
That's exactly what happened during the debates, the Republican debates, when they started talking about the tax system. And he said, I don't pay much taxes, I'm smart.
It proves I'm smart.
And his polls, went up.
Yeah.
He learned right then and there that it was a good approach. Mm-hmm. And then the people who read the Times story and went, oh my God, this is horrible. Well, those people who already thought that way about Trump to begin with. So that's my other theory. But
a lot of people I've talked to, they mentioned Bernie Sanders and that if the establishment Democrats hadn't cheated him and the way how corrupt they were in that election, that maybe he could have, he probably would have beat Trump, because he's certainly more sensible, more intelligent, progressive, and you name it. And also what you said about the system is rigged. Most black people that I know, they've been knowing that for generations. It's nothing, it opened, our eyes were already open, and that had been for generations since we first arrived in this country.
Yeah, it's interesting to speculate what would have happened if Sanders had gotten the nomination. In the spring of 2016, he was polling much better against Trump than Hillary Clinton was. That is a fact. Whether that would have been borne out, over the course of events, we'll never know. But certainly, Donna Brazile, in her book, there were some stunning revelations in that book, namely the extent to which the Hillary Clinton campaign had gained control of the Democratic Party by early fall 2015. The Democratic Party's finances were in such dire shape that the party went to her and said, look, we need your money, all this money you're raising. And so there was an agreement between Hillary Clinton's campaign and the Democratic Party where Clinton's campaign would have final say over all staffing decisions in the party, and it would have complete control of data analysis, communications. Basically, Hillary was running the Democratic Party. So, obviously that is not a level playing field for any other candidates trying for the Democratic nomination. That's another scandal that's not a scandal.
Yeah, I don't know if you'd want to speculate on what we can do now, whether or not, say, hypothetically, say the House does flip to Democrats. I would, like the person I'm supporting locally in Montgomery County is very worried about going to impeachment because that may, basically we may end up with civil war or something like that. But also the question is like the only person I can think that can save us, it's like save us Bernie Sanders, you're our only hope in 2020. So my question is to actually, how can we get out of this mess? We do need more jobs. So some of what Trump is saying, we want better jobs and things in America makes sense. We do need better trade treaties and things like that. We do need people to respect that. So is there any ideas you have for how we can get there? Or ideas, for instance, like they may run Hillary again in 2020. I'm ready for a woman president. A lot of people aren't, and so I wouldn't recommend they do that. So if you have any ideas for what would make sense maybe to do, just a speculation, or things we should avoid doing, just so we can, actually make America great.
Yeah, I really want to avoid, speculating because I don't know anything. And there's so many variables and so many things we don't know and so much uncertainty in the future. I will say this. I don't think we're going to get profound change in this country, the kind of change that will truly make things better in a fundamental way, short of an existential crisis. I think that's just what it's going to take. And so when Bernie Sanders says, I'm calling for a political revolution in this country, that's not, just rhetoric. That's not just Bernie Sanders, rallying the troops and getting everybody fired up. He is taking his political logic to its ultimate conclusion. If anything is going to change, a lot of things are going to have to change at the same time. And, starting with money in politics and big money, how are you going to get Congress to enact meaningful campaign finance reform when Congress has benefited, the people in Congress have benefited mightily from the system as is? And I think the only thing that would, bring about a mass movement, a revolution that would, as the old saying goes, vote the bastards out, is an existential crisis. We saw it happen in 1932. Not only was Franklin Roosevelt elected, he was elected on a wave of successful Democratic candidates, so that when he came into office in 1933, he had that, an overwhelming massive support in Congress to get to work immediately. If Bernie Sanders had won in 2016, you can imagine, but with the Congress that was elected, you can imagine what would be going on, or Hillary Clinton. And so I think we're going to be stuck in the mud for a while longer. I'm not advocating for an existential crisis. I don't want an existential crisis because, there's no guarantee we'll come out of that intact or better. But I think it's going to be thrust upon us in some way, either an economic crisis or a constitutional crisis, or, Trump pulling an Erdogan, like in Turkey, where he so destabilizes the system that, it triggers some kind of economic, upheaval.
I want to thank everybody for coming. I just had one. I'm going to ask this last question because you teed it up in a way. You finished this book. And I'm wondering if you feel like we're now in the middle of the story, that you sort of, the book finishes in the middle of the story. There's a line in your book where you sung that when the Trump era came in, you said, we hadn't known that this journey that looked so much like progress was in fact a fantasy, a happy story we told ourselves along the way. So the story's not finished yet. The story that you told in the book is not finished yet. And I'm just wondering if, as another project, if you've thought at all of sort of continuing on in this vein in terms of essay writing and journalism for yourself to help discover how this story is going to end.
We'll see. You know, I really don't want to think about it right now. You know, I don't want to dive into it the way I had to do to write this book yet. I mean, I just finished it, and I went on a short story streak this summer. It's so wonderful to make things up. I mean, it's because everything you make up is true. I mean, nobody can dispute that the character did this or that because it came out of my head. I mean, so, but I will probably, I mean, that's where my head and my heart have always taken me, toward power and politics and race and history and economics. I mean, toward, you know, what constitutes basic justice, you know, what constitutes a system of society that offers, you know, some minimal level of decency and dignity to its people, to all its people. And I feel like that's what I'm writing about in one way or another all the time. And I mean, I'm going to write fiction for a while, and then we'll see if I have the stomach and the opportunity to go back to facts.
Well, let's wish Ben well on his continued journey.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.